What's a good argument? Argumentation theory goes all the way back to the Greeks and even further. And I won't bore you too much with a long history of argumentation theory, except to say that in general an argument has been understood to be at least three things. 1. An act of persuasion. 2. A logical exercise. And 3. A discussion, a quarrel or a dispute. Let's have a look at these three viewpoints a bit closer. If you approach an argument as being an act of persuasion, you should study classical rhetorical theory all the way back to Aristotle, who in fact did a pretty good job at identifying the means by which a public speaker or writer convinces an audience of a certain point of view. Aristotle called these means logos, pathos and ethos. This was a very practical understanding of an argument and emphasized the performance of the speaker or the writer. Other important philosophers of this very long tradition were of course Plato, who had a much more dialogical understanding of making an argument, the Roman philosopher Cicero, and the medieval scholars who taught rhetorics as one of the central subjects in the cathedral schools and in the later universities. An influential and recent account of practical argumentation theory in the tradition of Aristotle has been developed in 1958 by the British philosopher Stephen Toulmin. By analyzing real-life examples, he identified the main elements of a written argument as 1. Making a claim, 2. Backing it up with some hard evidence or truthful data that cannot be challenged, then 3. Provide a warrant which links the backing to the claim, for instance by telling us why the data makes claim to the truth. Next, 4. The writer should discuss possible rebuttals to the warrant. And finally, if needed, add some qualifying statements which will put the whole thing into its proper perspective. So, most importantly, Toulmin believed that a good argument should provide a good justification for the claim in order to be able to persuade and to stand up to possible criticism. If you approach an argument mainly as being the first part of the Aristotelian appeals, that is, as a logical exercise, you try to prove or disprove a claim by the means of deductive and logical reasoning. This will lead you to discussing the validity of the premises, to identify causal relationships, and to test for logical fallacies. It's a quite restricted definition of an argument, very scientific you could say. But again, it has a rich history since Aristotle. He defined deduction as something that necessarily follows from some other things which are supposed to be true. This type of reasoning can be put into the formula of the syllogism, which is a three-sentence combination of 1. A general statement, and 2. A more specific statement from which a conclusion is deduced. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. From the rediscovery of Aristotle in the Renaissance and onwards, a lot of energy has been invested into the refinement and further expansion of deductive reasoning. In the 17th century, for instance, Sir Francis Bacon rejected the idea of a syllogism as the best way to draw conclusions. Instead, he proposed that the supposed true statements of a syllogism should be replaced by experimentation, as much as possible, which in turn would lead to the discovery of more general conclusions. Instead of a deductive syllogism, he in reality proposed that scientific knowledge is best obtained by induction, which means by careful observation of nature. Of more recent interest, and of interest to the current practice of scientific argumentation, is the philosophical idea of positivism, in particular the logical positivists from the beginning of the 20th century. They believed that there in fact is such a thing as an ideal argument, independent of the person who presents it, and all that is needed to find it is to use your senses and your reason. If you do that, you only need to apply a complete and consistent logical system by which you can sort out and verify the truth. The logical positivists tried to find this system but failed. Anyway, many natural scientists today still have a deep conscious or unconscious veneration for the positivist attitude, as expressed by the French philosopher and father of positivism, Auguste Comte. For instance, by believing that the hard sciences are the highest and most true forms of knowledge, that you only should believe in things which can be verified empirically, and that any kind of authority, except the authority of the scientific method, should be viewed upon with utmost skepticism. Now we come to the third and last view on what an argument is: a discussion. If you regard an academic argument as a discussion, a dialogue, or a dispute, you probably accept the idea that there is no such thing as an ideal argument independent of the person who presents it. There is no single truth which can be derived by the senses and logic alone. Rather, you see the truth of an argument as a dialectical process, where you formulate some thesis, some antithesis and synthesis, which will help you to map out polarized positions and maybe, if you are lucky, find some common ground, a consensus. This definition of an argument has only recently gained currency within the theories of science communication, even though its basic tenets are very old and even older than the other definitions. You probably all know about Socrates and his so-called Socratic method. It's a typical dialectical process. Socrates used a carefully crafted dialogue to bring out his opponents' or interlocutors' claims and beliefs. Then he scrutinized their implicit assumptions with a series of questions formulated as logical tests and as tests of fact. In this way, contradictions were identified and eliminated, leading to the formulation of better hypotheses. Aristotle called this Socratic process induction, because it relies on making better and better guesses iteratively, testing them continuously and generalizing from them. Again, this line of thinking has a rich history and has had foundational impact on Western philosophical thinking. If you seek the truth by compromise, you would use what is sometimes called a Rogerian argument, as formulated by the American psychologist Carl Rogers in 1970. In practice, a Rogerian argument has 4 parts. It starts with stating the problem at hand in such a manner that it doesn't antagonize anybody, which means that you shouldn't start with your own opinions, but rather try to be general and neutral. Second, you should acknowledge other points of view on this problem without making a mockery out of them. Then, thirdly, you should present your own point of view as clearly as possible and include some key evidence in support of it. Finally, you should suggest a compromise and preferably show your readers or listeners that their position could benefit by adopting your point of view. In addition, you could also offer alternative solutions as part of a compromise and let your readers or listeners reflect on them. In recent times, this cooperative and consensus-oriented definition has been given a lot of currency with the ideas of a deliberative or a discursive democracy, where you engage the public in a thoughtful dialogue about options available in a democratic decision-making process. We'll talk more about these things in later lectures. A very popular book from 2007 called They Say, I Say, written by the American academics Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein, draws heavily on this Rogerian approach, maybe without being quite as soft and consensus-seeking as he was. Its main argument is that writing is a conversation, and that good conversations always start with summarizing others, what they say, and then to set up one's own argument, what I say. The book provides plenty of simple templates by which students can learn to make their academic arguments. Here I show you 2 examples. Most scholars in the field believe X. As a result of my study, Y. Or the second one, in discussion of this and this, a controversial issue is whether so and so. While some argue that blah blah blah, others contend that blah blah blah. And that's not to say that so and so. Especially as a student, you often encounter seemingly insurmountable barriers when entering an ongoing academic discussion. In order to have a chance being accepted into the discourse community, you need to learn to recapitulate and to rephrase the current state of the discussion. And you need to express the views of the others correctly and in a short time. So the book is a quite valuable and concrete guide by which you can learn to enter an academic discussion. Okay, so when looking at this extremely short history of argumentation theory, what is interesting to see is the slow transition from vertical or authoritarian theories to more horizontal or egalitarian theories of argumentation, at least in terms of who speaks to whom. The Aristotelian appeals rely on training the logical faculty and the natural authority of the speaker, including his or her ability to apply this to a pliable audience. So it's a linear, top-down style of communication. The positivist emphasis on experiment, reason and logic tried to abandon authority as a condition for a good argument, but still only managed to replace it with another type of authority, namely the authority of positive knowledge and the internal truth of a statement. The most popular recent definitions of an argument as a deliberative and consensus-seeking process are much more horizontal or egalitarian in their approach. Here, communication goes both ways and treats the truth as something that hopefully will emerge from the complex interactions of the plurality of voices. Of course, there are many additional aspects to this story, but it's probably safe to say that many scientists suspect this pluralistic and postmodern approach to be far too relativistic when it comes to communicating science. It risks to invalidate this superiority of facts and to make the truth more or less irrelevant. Whether this suspicion is justified or not is something we will look at later in the course.